The scent hit me before the scout's boots hit the courtyard stone, fierce sweat and horse lather, and something colder underneath it, the smell of a man who has ridden through the night to bring you news he wishes he didn't have. I was on the east wall when he came through the gate, and I was down the stairs before he'd swung off his horse. "Maddox Graymore," he said before I'd even asked. "Riding under the black banner, 3 days out, maybe less if he pushes the horses. He's declared blood dead on the Veilstrom line, my king. He means to end it before it starts." I felt the words land somewhere behind my ribs, cold and precise as a blade finding the gap in armor. Before it starts. He meant Isolde. He meant the child she was carrying low and heavy now. The child who by the healer's count had perhaps a fortnight left inside her and might, by the stubborn way she'd been walking the last few days, have a good deal less than that. "How sure?" I said. "Sure enough that I didn't stop to eat, my king. I sent him to the kitchens anyway, because a man who rides 3 days on empty deserves bread even when the news he carries is bad enough to curdle it in your stomach, and I went to find my wife. She was in the solar with the windows open to catch the last of the light, sitting with her feet up on a stool the way the healer had ordered, and she rescented, a half-finished piece of embroidery in her lap that I knew for a fact she was doing badly on purpose, because she found the whole business tedious and only kept at it to have somewhere to put her hands. She looked up when I came in, and whatever she saw in my face made her set the needle down without being asked. "Tell me," she said. "I have led men into battles I described honestly as unwinnable and watched them square their shoulders anyway. I have stood in front of my own council and told them the harvest would fail and we would eat thin through the winter. None of it prepared me to stand in a room gone gold with evening light and tell the woman carrying my child that a man was riding toward her with murder already decided in his heart. So I told her plainly, because she had never once thanked me for softening a hard thing, and she listened with her hands folded over the curve of her belly and her spine very straight, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Maddox Graymore," she said finally, "your father's name in your mouth always sounds like an apology waiting to happen. What did he do to that man?" She had always been able to see straight through to the bone of a thing. It was, I sometimes thought, the most dangerous quality a healer's daughter could have, that unwillingness to be handed the comfortable version of a story. "There was a debt," I said, "before I was born, a border dispute and a hostage taken to settle it. Maddox's younger brother held here at Stormhollow as surety while the treaty terms were argued. My father meant it as formality. It became something crueler than that. The boy died here, of a fever the healers couldn't turn in the second winter of his keeping. My father sent no compensation, no formal grief. Only silence, because he did not know how to send anything else, and Maddox has carried that silence for 30 years like a coal banked under ash, waiting for wind." "And now the wind is us," Isolde said. "Now the wind is our son," I said, and watched her hand still against the swell of her belly, and hated, for the first time in my life, a father I had otherwise only ever tried to be better than. I want to tell you I comforted her well in that moment. I did not. I paced. I said the word unacceptable more times than a king with any real power in a room should ever need to say it, as though repetition could rewrite the arithmetic of 3 days' ride against a wall that had gone soft on its northern face, and a mate who could not run even if running had ever once been the answer for either of us. It was Isolde in the end, who rose slowly, one hand braced on the chair, waving off my help with a look that told me exactly what she thought of being fussed over, and crossed the room and put both her hands flat against my chest, over the place where my heart was going too fast for a king who was supposed to be the calm one. "Callan," she said, "look at me, not at the wall, not at the ledger of your father's debts, at me." I looked at her. "We have 3 days," she said. "That is not nothing. That is time to fortify a gate, time to send riders to your allies, time for me to walk the wall myself, and tell you exactly which stones I'd hate to be standing under if a catapult found them. I did not survive my mother's illness and my father's grief and 11 years of watching men die of wounds that should not have killed them by learning how to be afraid of a deadline. Give me something to do, or I will embroider something so ugly it will haunt this solar for a century. I laughed. I had not expected to laugh that evening, and the sound of it surprised us both, and something in my chest that had been pulled tight since the courtyard eased by a degree that mattered more than it should have. That was the truth about the bond. If anyone had asked me to name it honestly instead of in the grand language the bards like to use, it was not a lightning strike. It was not my wolf going still or rising or howling at first sight of her, though something in me had certainly noticed, 3 years ago, when a healer's daughter with flowers still on her sleeves had walked into my hall to argue with my physician about a treatment he was doing wrong, and had been right. The bond, in the years since, had become something quieter and more load-bearing than lightning. It was this, that, in the worst hour of a very bad evening, her hand on my chest could do what 3 days of frantic strategy in my own head could not. We did not sleep well that night. We lay facing each other in the dark, her belly a warm curve between us, and she told me the names she still hadn't decided between for our son, Bram, after her grandfather, or Eamon, which she liked the sound of and would not explain further. And I told her about my own mother, dead now 9 years, and the lullaby she used to sing in a language that had died with the last of her people, of which I remembered only 3 lines and could not, for the life of me, hold the tune. Isolde hummed something back that wasn't the same song but might, she said, be close enough that our son would never know the difference. And somewhere in the middle of that, without either of us quite deciding to, we slept. The next morning Stormhillow began to change shape around us the way a body braces before a blow it can see coming. I had the northern wall crews doubled before the sun was fully up. I sent riders to Ashfin and to the Coombe Pack, calling old alliances that I hoped would still hold, though Maddox had spent 30 patient years cultivating grievances of his own across 3 territories, and I could not be certain how many doors would open when my messengers knocked. I walked the wall myself, as Isolde had promised she would, except that she walked it with me despite my objections, one hand resting on the stone as though she could feel through it exactly where the weakness ran, which, infuriatingly, wonderfully, she often could. Here, she said, at a section of wall that looked, to my eye, no different from any other. The mortar's gone soft. I can smell the damp in it. If they bring anything heavier than arrows, this is where it fails first. I had the masons on it within the hour. She was right, of course. She was usually right, which was one of several reasons I had married her, and none of the reasons anyone at court had expected me to. It was on the second day that the thing happened which I would spend a long while afterward turning over, unable to decide whether to name it luck or the bond's own strange intelligence, the kind that moves through a mated pair like weather moving through connected valleys, unseen but never quite separate. I was in the war room with my captains when Isolde came to the door, not sent for, not summoned, simply there, one hand pressed to the frame, her face gone the particular still white of someone working very hard not to alarm anyone. "There's a man in the kitchens who isn't a man from the kitchens," she said. I did not ask her how she knew. Later she would tell me it was a smell, sweat with a wrongness underneath it, the specific tension of someone whose hands were doing one thing while his whole body was listening for something else. The same instinct, she said, that had once told her a fevered patient was about to seize a full minute before it happened. In the moment, I only moved, and my captain moved with me, and we found him at the well behind the kitchens with a vial in his hand, and a look on his face that told us everything before he said a single word. He was young, younger than I expected an assassin to be, though I suppose that is a foolish thing to expect, as though death sends only the weathered and the willing. He'd been paid, he told us later, under questioning that I insisted stay well short of cruelty because I would not become, in my own house, the kind of king who answers old grievances with new ones. Paid to poison the well that fed the keep's eastern wing, my wing, our wing, the nursery already half prepared with its cradle and its stacked linens, and to be gone before anyone noticed the water had turned. Maddox didn't want to wait for the wall, Isolde said quietly after, when it was just the two of us in our chamber, and my hands had finally stopped shaking with an anger I had not let myself show the boy at the well. He wanted it done before he even had to look either of us in the face. He'll have to now, I said. Whatever else happens, he'll have to stand in front of me and say it plainly, because I am done letting this stay a coward silence pass down like an heirloom. She came and sat beside me and put her hand over mine, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. Outside, the sound of the wall crews working carried faintly through the stone, hammers, voices, the ordinary industry of people trying to survive an extraordinary week. "I'm not afraid of him," she said finally. "I want you to know that. I'm afraid of what fear does to good plans, so we will not let it. We will finish what we started, and we will be ready, and when he comes, he will find a wall that holds and a mate who does not run, because I have never once in my life run from something simply because it was large." I believed her. I had watched her over 3 years face down a fever that had killed 2 healers before her, face down a council of my own lords who did not think a commoner's daughter belonged at my side, face down her own mother's death with a steadiness that had frightened me a little, the first time I saw it, because I did not understand yet how much of it was armor and how much was simply who she was underneath. I believed her, and I was wrong to think that belief would make the coming days any easier to bear. They came on the evening of the 3rd day, exactly as the scout had warned, under a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, purple-black at the edges, a raw yellow low on the horizon where the sun was going down behind Maddox's banners. I stood on the wall and watched his army come up out of the ironwood tree line like something the forest itself was exhaling. And beside me, my captains went quiet in the particular way soldiers go quiet before something they cannot pretend, even to themselves, will be easy. Maddox rode at the front. I had met him once, years before, at a border parley that had gone nowhere, and I remembered him as a gray, contained man, careful with his words in the way of someone who has learned that words cost more than most people realize. He did not look contained now. He looked like a man who had spent 30 years building a single structure inside himself and had finally, catastrophically, finished it. "Callan Veilstrom," he called up, his voice carrying easily across the space between us, trained by decades of command to need no shouting. "I have no quarrel with your wall or your wolves. Send out the woman and end this before I have to take her from you." I felt Isolde's presence behind me before I heard her. She had come up onto the wall despite the healer's protests, despite mine, moving with the careful, deliberate weight of someone very late in a pregnancy and entirely unwilling to be told she couldn't stand where she chose to stand. She came to the rampart's edge beside me, and I watched Maddox's face change when he saw, unmistakably, the shape of her, the reason his 30-year grievance had suddenly acquired a deadline. "I am not a debt to be collected," she called down, before I could speak, her voice steady in a way that made something in my chest ache with pride even through the fear. "I am not my husband's father, and my son is not your brother's ghost. If you want an accounting, Lord Greymore, I will give you one honestly here, in front of both our people. But you will not have it by killing a woman who never wronged you or a child who does not yet exist to answer for a crime he cannot have committed." For one long moment, Maddox said nothing. I watched something move behind his eyes, not softness, not yet, but the specific hesitation of a man whose story has just been interrupted by a voice he had not built into the telling of it. Then his jaw set, and the moment closed, and he raised his hand, and the ironwood tree line behind him came alive with the sound of an army deciding, all at once, to become a weapon. I will not pretend the battle that followed was anything but what battles are: loud, ugly, longer in the living of it than in any telling. The soft wall Isolde had marked held for the first hour and then began, as she'd predicted, to fail. And I spent that hour and the two after it doing the grim arithmetic of command, moving crews and archers and my own body from place to place as the need shifted, aware always, in the animal part of my mind that never quite stopped tracking her, of exactly where Isolde was inside the keep. She was supposed to be in the inner chamber, behind 3 doors and a dozen guards, as far from the fighting as stone and distance could put her. That was the plan. Plans, I have found, rarely survive contact with a mate who has decided the plan is wrong. It was near midnight, with the eastern gate buckling under a third assault, and my own sword arm gone heavy with a tiredness that was more grief than exhaustion, when word reached me that changed the shape of everything. Isolde's labor had begun. Early, nearly a full fortnight early, the healer said, though later we would both privately agree it was not so early after all, that some things simply arrive when they are ready, and the body's calendar bends to meet a night that demands it. And it had begun in the worst possible place at the worst possible hour, with the keep's inner ward breached and Maddox's own captain, a broad, scarred man named Ossian, already cutting his way toward the very chamber where she lay. I do not remember the run from the eastern gate to the inner ward. I remember only that I arrived to find the corridor outside our chamber already a battlefield in miniature, 2 of my guards down, a third holding the doorway with a spear, and a face gone the white of a man who knows he is the last thing standing between disaster and the people behind him. And I remember what I saw when I finally forced my way past him into the room. Isolde was not lying down. She was standing, one hand braced against the doorframe of the inner chamber where the healer had been trying, uselessly, to move her to a bed further back. Her whole body racked visibly with a labor that had chosen, with a cruelty I would spend years being furious about, to arrive in the exact hour her son's safety required every ounce of strength she had left for something else entirely. And in front of her, between her and the door where Ossian's men were breaking through, stood nothing. No guard, no wall, only her. "Isolde," I started, and she turned her head, and even through the sweat and the pain plainly written across her face, her eyes found mine with a clarity that stopped my heart harder than any blade could have. "He is not getting past me," she said, "and neither is anyone else until this door is mine to give up. Do you understand me, Callan? I am not moving." Ossian's men broke through a heartbeat later, and I have never in my life moved the way I moved in the space after that. Not thought, not strategy, only the animal certainty of a mate between his family and a blade, and something in me that was not entirely wolf and not entirely man tore loose, and met them in the doorway with a violence I do not fully remember and have never regretted. I put down the first 2 men before they'd fully cleared the threshold. The third, Ossian himself, broad and grim and clearly the better fighter of any of us on our feet in that corridor. I fought with everything 3 days of dread and 1 entire night of terror had built up in me, and it was close, closer than I like to admit even now, his blade opening a line of fire along my ribs that I would not properly feel until hours later, before I finally put him down and did not, in that moment, feel anything resembling mercy. Behind me, Isolde had not moved from the doorway. Could not have moved, I understood later. The labor had progressed past the point where retreat was any longer a choice her body would allow her, and so she had done, in the truest sense, the only thing left available to her. She had stood and held the line with nothing but her own unmoving presence, and trusted that the bond between us would bring me to her in time. It did. I do not know how else to explain the timing of it, except to say that whatever the bond is, not lightning, not a single moment, but the long, quiet architecture of 2 lives built to hold each other up, it had done, in the worst hour of our lives, exactly the thing it was built for. The healer got Isolde to the bed at last, past the bodies in the doorway that I had guards clear within the minute, and I knelt beside her with my ribs screaming and my hands that had just done violence I would carry for a long time, now doing nothing but holding hers. And outside the walls the sound of battle was still going, still uncertain. Maddox's forces still pressing at a gate. My captains were holding without me because there was no possible version of this night in which I left this room. "Stay with me," Isolde said, between one contraction and the next, her grip on my hand fierce enough to hurt. "And do not you dare look away to check on that battle, Callan Veilstrom. I can hear you thinking about it." "I'm not thinking about anything but you," I said, and it was, for the first time in 3 days, entirely true. Our son was born a little before dawn, while the sounds outside the walls were finally, gradually, changing character, shouts of retreat instead of assault, the specific ragged relief of a defense that has held. I would learn only afterward that it was the death of Ossian, more than any wall or any crew, that had broken the spine of Maddox's assault. His men, seeing their captain fall and word spreading fast of what had happened in that corridor, had lost whatever appetite for the night's work they'd started with. And Maddox himself, when my captains finally cornered him near the eastern gate as the sky was going gray, had simply stopped fighting, as though the 30-year structure inside him had finally, at long last, run out of foundation to stand on. But I did not know any of that yet, in the moment my son drew his first breath. I knew only the sound of it, a thin, furious, entirely healthy cry that filled the chamber, and somehow, in a way I would never be able to explain to anyone who had not stood in that exact doorway 3 hours before, seemed to reach the corridor beyond it, and the courtyard beyond that, and the wall beyond that, so that for one suspended moment the whole of Stormhollow, soldiers and healers and the exhausted remnant of an enemy's army alike, went entirely, completely quiet, as though even violence knew enough to pause for it. Isolde held him first, of course. I have never in my life seen anything the way I saw her in that moment. Undone in a way the siege had never come close to undoing her, her whole fierce, immovable presence gone suddenly, wonderfully soft, tears cutting clean lines through 3 days' worth of dust and fear on her face as she looked down at him. "Eamon," she said finally, answering a question I hadn't asked, her voice cracking on the name in a way that told me she had, somewhere in the last unbearable hours, made the decision without telling me. "His name is Eamon." I did not ask her why. I have wondered since, and I think I know that some names are chosen not for what they mean, but for the shape of the mouth that says them, for how they sound in a room that has just survived something it should not have survived. But in that moment I only leaned down and touched my son's small, furious face, and felt something break open in my chest that had nothing to do with the wound in my side, and I did not try to name it. Some things do not need naming to be understood. Maddox Greymore stood in my hall 3 days later, under guard but not in chains, because I had decided somewhere in the long, quiet hours of that night that I would not answer a 30-year silence with another one. He would not meet my eyes at first. He looked instead at Isolde, who sat with Eamon sleeping against her shoulder, and did not look away from him at all. "Your brother died in a room 2 floors above where you're standing," I said, "of a fever my father's healers should have caught sooner and didn't, and my father answered that with nothing, no letter, no reparation, no acknowledgement that a child had died under his roof while owed his protection. I will not pretend that dead away. I will not pretend you had no cause. But you brought an army against a woman in labor, and a son who had not yet drawn breath, Maddox, and there is no old grief large enough to make that anything other than what it was." He was silent a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the trained, careful edge I remembered from the parley years before. It sounded instead like something that had been holding its breath for 3 decades and had finally, exhaustedly, let it go. "I have hated your family since I was 11 years old," he said. "I do not know how to be a man who doesn't. I built my whole life around it, and I marched it against an infant, and I don't." He stopped. Isolde shifted Eamon slightly against her shoulder, and something in Maddox's face cracked at the small, ordinary sound the boy made in his sleep. I don't know what's left of me if not that. Then find out, Isolde said quietly before I could answer. There is a stone in the eastern garden with your brother's name on it. My husband had it carved the week I told him I was carrying, because he said no child should die forgotten under this roof again, and no one had ever properly grieved him. You are welcome to stand there as long as you need. And when you are done standing there, Lord Greymore, you are welcome to come find out what an honest accounting from this family actually looks like, instead of the silence you were given the first time. I had not told her about the stone. I had ordered it carved in a private hour, meaning to tell her once it was finished, and I understood, watching Maddox's face come apart entirely at her words, that she had known anyway, had felt it perhaps, the way she felt soft mortar through solid stone, some quiet current of the bond between the three of us that ran wider now than just the two of us alone. Maddox went to the garden that afternoon and stayed until well past dark. He did not become, in the seasons that followed, a friend exactly. Some 30-year structures do not fall all at once. However, honestly, the ground beneath them shifts. But the Black Banners did not come again. And when a hard winter struck 2 years later and Stormhillow's stores ran thin, it was grain from the Greymore lands that arrived unasked, with no letter attached beyond a single line. For the boy, so he grows up owing no one a debt his father didn't choose. I think of that doorway often still, Isolde standing in it, unmoving, carrying our son into the world with the same steadiness she'd used to mark a failing wall, to argue down a physician, to tell an approaching army exactly what it would and wouldn't be permitted to take. The bards who came later to set the siege of Stormhillow into song made much of the battle, of Ossian's fall, of the Black Banners turning back at dawn. They made less of the doorway, because a woman standing still is a harder thing to put a tune to than a sword swung in anger. But I was there. I know which one saved us. Eamon is older now, old enough to ask on quiet evenings how his mother and father met, and I tell him the truth every time, that she walked into my hall to argue with a physician who was wrong and was right, and that some bonds are not lightning at all but the kind of steadiness a person builds, day by ordinary day, until the night comes that asks everything of it at once, and it holds anyway. He does not always believe the part about the doorway. He asks his mother to confirm it, and she only smiles and touches the old thin scar along my ribs that never entirely faded, and says nothing at all, because some things I have learned from her are better held quiet than told twice.